All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, for making the time, for learning in this space, and for taking an interest in disentangling disinformation. This series was born out of the current global moment, but it's also a reflection of societal shifts that have slowly been taking place over the course of decades and have made themselves more apparent of late. Information is limitless and constantly at odds. We live in an era where the confines of understanding are not limited to a lack of information, but rather a bombardment of countering narratives. It can be daunting to sift through the barrage of messaging, and it leaves room for a simple and harmful decision to just ignore things. Oftentimes, what we see online is not necessarily what is happening out in the world, or maybe it's represented differently, and that disinformation can cost us the ability to stay accurately informed. So this series really intends to address some of that, some of the different forms in which disinformation takes place, and really can find a stronghold online and give some tools to navigate the current landscape of media and make sense of what we see, and even kind of within us, the different conflict that might exist with information that is out there. The series will have people from different fields and from different disciplines presenting their research and their experience with disinformation. So please check out the PPD website to see both our next talk, and then as we continue the series in the spring, what talks we'll have forthcoming. The series was assembled with a combined effort from the Program on Peace and Development at Yale University, MADE, which is Mass Atrocities in the Digital Era, which is part of the Genocide Studies program at Yale, and also the Department of Social Justice Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Weir. I'm with Hira, co-director of the Program on Peace and Development at Yale. And as we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Yale University also acknowledges that Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Chautauqua, Golden Hill Pagosset, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the land and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Megan Bowler. I'm a professor in the Department of Social Justice Education, one of the co-hosts of this event at the University of Toronto, and I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Daniel Carell. And I'm particularly excited because I've read his work over the past several years and not had the opportunity to hear him speak, so this is fantastic. Daniel Carell's research interests lie at the intersection of culture, communication, and contentious politics. Much of his work draws on digital media data and computational methodologies. Some of Daniel's current projects examine how social media shape instances of political unrest and violence, the role of discourse and networks in the growth of extremist online communities, and how people justify and tolerate violence against members of other groups. His research has appeared in various academic journals, including American Sociological Review, Sociological Methodology, and Poetics. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Yale University. And with that, over to you, Doctor.
Everyone, thank you, Megan, for the introduction, and for everyone else, for the Bonnie and Hira for the invitation to speak. I'm very happy to be here and honored and delighted to talk a little bit about disinformation. So let me share my slides, go through this process here. Okay. This is good. Although I guess now I can't see everyone, but
Yep, looks good.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Megan. Okay, so yeah, today I will talk about, or today I'm hoping to talk about online speech and offline actions, and specifically, or kind of foreground at the core of this talk, the mechanisms linking digital discourse and offline consequences, which, as you'll see, is kind of how I kind of entered this very large area of scholarship on disinformation, is through this link between what happens online and offline. But I'll begin with I thought I would begin with a little bit of a review on the academic scholarship on disinformation, just very brief and kind of very, very high level, which hopefully will provide some context for this talk. So disinformation research really took off in 2016. And since then, scholars have created, across many, many disciplines, not just the social sciences, of course, have created an enormous and still expanding literature on disinformation. At the very beginning, early research sought to define what this actually meant. And kind of initial definitions were kind of comparisons of fake news versus real news. One of the earliest references to disinformation actually came from a BuzzFeed News article by Silverman in 2016, which was just simply comparing examples of this. And then after a couple of years, the scholarship, at least the disinformation scholarship that kind of in the social science domain that I operate, has largely settled on thinking of disinformation as the intentional distribution of fabricated or misleading stories to advance political goals. And so the kind of the importance of intention kind of help differentiate disinformation from, say, misinformation, or just kind of simply inaccurate or misleading information. And then kind of tied with this intentionality was the idea of advancing some sort of goals, there being a reason for this. And then there was a kind of, after this, quickly after this, there emerged this kind of second wave of research, which examined how disinformation operated in the world. One of the classical pieces in this, or now classic pieces in this type of disinformation research, was published in Science, and it showed evidence that fake news spread faster and kind of diffused further through networks compared to real news. And so this was kind of the idea that disinformation not only was conceptually distinct, but actually acted distinct, or behaved distinct in the real world, which is of course important for us to care about it. Recently, though, and I think it's very interesting, some researchers are returning to the question of definition. Kind of what exactly is disinformation? So, disinformation has often been seen as a behavioral problem, right? It's an act or something that somebody does. Like, remember that the part of that definition about intention. But increasingly, kind of people, mostly I see this in communications and information sciences, this notion that disinformation is often participatory and even ritualistic. And the idea here is that many people play an interactive role in creating and developing and sustaining disinformation. And people do this kind of ritualistic or participatory construction of it as an effort to collectively organize, at least what two communication scholars refer to as an overflow of information into comprehensive narratives. I'll actually return to this later and hope that this kind of stimulates some discussion, because I'd love to hear what people think about this. And then finally, despite this large literature, there's been relatively little attention paid to the extent that disinformation changes people's behavior. And this observation is what has motivated my current work. The idea here is that, to what extent is disinformation influencing how people are acting offline? So, we know disinformation is different than misinformation or other information. We know that it operates differently in the sense that it spreads or diffuses differently. But I was kind of curious as to, did it matter in the offline sense? And this turns out that it's a very difficult question to answer because of selection. Essentially, the idea that people consuming a certain kind of disinformation often already think like that information, right? So they select into consuming it. And I'll elaborate on this in the talk. But if this notion that people already kind of believe in the disinformation that they're consuming, then how exactly would disinformation lead them to behave in ways they otherwise would not have? And so this was kind of, this will motivate the middle part of this talk. So today, I was hoping to touch on 3 topics, or planning to touch on 3 topics. First, just provide a concrete example of disinformation, specifically the Stop the Steal movement in response to the 2020 US presidential election. And then I'll talk about mechanisms that tie online disinformation to offline behavior. And then third, try to circle back to this idea of disinformation, or defining disinformation, and talk a little bit about what does this mean for thinking about disinformation in general. So my goals are to provide a generalish, I'll talk about Stop the Steal, but kind of more of a general description of some concrete disinformation. Provide some insight into how online disinformation can influence offline behavior, and finally discuss 2 ways to think about disinformation. And my overall intention and goal is to simply share some ideas and insights from this work and the scholarship to support a discussion. I'd love to hear, in the Q&A session, a lot of what people think, and hopefully leave enough time for a robust discussion. I'll also say that I've broken up the talk in these 3 topics to allow some pauses to see if there are any questions, clarification questions, or kind of immediately relevant questions to each of these 3 sections that I've listed here under topics. So I'll be pausing for a second, or for a few seconds after each topic. And so if there are any questions that come to mind that are specifically relevant or need clarification, feel free to put them in the Q&A chat function, and as I go along, and then maybe we could try to field those. If that becomes a little bit tricky to do that in this format, then we can just return to them at the end. Okay, so to begin, this idea of an example, or to begin, I'll start with this example of disinformation in the Stop the Steal movement. So I'm assuming many people are familiar with this, but just in case anyone isn't, after the 2020 US presidential election, President Trump and his allies undertook this campaign to convince the public that Trump lost the election because of fraud. It was a legitimate loss. And this campaign involved messaging across many different media types, and it also involved actors at many levels of politics and media. And so there's an ongoing study. I'm not doing it, but it's happening, and I'm aware of it, and have read some early versions of it. So I'm going to borrow from these colleagues. There's this ongoing study that examined over 100,000 Facebook posts of county Republican Party officials from 410 US counties. So for those of you, I know some folks are in Canada. So for those of you who are not familiar, counties is a lower level of aggregation, a political administration than the state. And so states are made up of counties, and it goes a bit below that as well, but this is kind of a local form of administration. And counties in the United States often have offices of the national party, or kind of representatives and officials and activists involved with the national political party, but they operate at the county level. So these are Facebook posts by local officials and members of the Republican Party. And so in the study, the intention was to identify specific discursive tactics specific to Stop the Steal. But for the purposes of this talk, which is not specifically about Stop the Steal, I'll try to generalize this a little bit to kind of give some lessons or some insights into disinformation in general. So the first discursive tactic is to exploit the bureaucratic process. So the idea here is that the administrative, legal, and bureaucratic processes surrounding local level elections in the United States are very confusing, actually, and they vary across counties. So not only are they complex, but there's no clear ways to kind of distinguish why my county is operating differently from your county and things like this. And also state versus state. So Stop the Steal campaigners took advantage of this complexity to allude to sinister plans unfolding kind of beyond the realm of knowing, right? So because it was hard to understand, there's this idea of like, oh, the things that are going on which you don't understand are not legitimate. Like they're potentially sinister or, you know, corrupt. And then when these processes did not end, when they ended up not overturning local results, they were more easily framed, or they were framed in a more more easily understandable way, which was simply as corruption, right? So rather than explain the complexity, the campaigners just said, oh, well, you know, don't worry about this complexity. It's actually just corruption. That's what happened. So I think the two general ideas to take away from this discursive tactic is this exploitation of complexity in real and actually true issues, but exploiting this, and also easing the complexity with a more simple comparing narrative, which in this case was corruption. The second discursive tactic in this Stop the Steal campaign was a sense of urgency and mobilization. So these campaigners constructed a collective action frame, which I'll explain in a second, that this particular study or these researchers label weaponized patriotism. So collective action frames comes from the social science scholarship on collective action and social movements and mobilization. And these frames are discursive strategies that do specific things. They identify problems, they attribute blame of the problems, like who caused the problems, and they propose solutions. So they're kind of these ways to kind of discursively frame, that's where the term comes from, issues in the world, but then also provide kind of a path to dealing with the issues. And these are often used by social movements to activate a set of beliefs that motivate or mobilize people to act. And in this case of Stop the Steal, the researchers of this conducting this study identified the frame of weaponized patriotism, which basically did identify a problem and propose a solution. And the problem in this case was that the foundations of America, sorry for the typo, the foundations of America are under attack by the left, the political left, and Democrats, in this case, big tech companies, the media, things like this. And the solution was to urgently get involved in and support the Stop the Steal movement to save the country. So I think the general idea here, beyond this particular case, is the idea that the Stop the Steal disinformation campaign identified a problem, connected it to core values, in this case, which is patriotism, and encouraged this urgent action to resolve the problem. The third discursive tactic was manufacturing an event. And this notion also comes from social science, and actually a very famous study by a historian, social science historian, William Sewell, which was this notion that political actors can construct events, that they can manufacture events. And what this means is this idea that narratives about real, concrete, discrete moments, narratives can transform them into something else and give them new meaning, and in the process reshape political processes and institutions. And what happened during Stop the Steal was that the people kind of spreading this disinformation, this campaign, they manufactured January 6, 2020 as a key event. So this was an actual process, a moment that was going to happen, which was the congressional certification of the election, but it was transformed or constructed to mean something else, which was an event or a chance to reverse the stolen election. And this idea, this manufacturing, ended up emerging through a feedback loop between national and political actors. So in the study, what the researchers find is that kind of local Republican party activists and officials are posting on Facebook kind of this idea of like, this can happen, and then they get some feedback from national discourse, and they kind of over time like build this up as like, this is our chance. This certification means something different. It's our chance to reverse the stolen election. So I think the general idea here is that the idea that meanings can be constructed and transform real moments into something else, and that this was an iterative, interactive, and social process. So some kind of general lessons here before I move on to the next topic is that disinformation can exploit complexity in real or true issues, and they can gain traction, or it can gain traction by easing this complexity with a simple compelling narrative. Disinformation can also identify a problem connected to core values and encourage urgent action. And it could give new meaning to real moments and events and things and organizations and objects. And I think we see this very often, this kind of this attempt to give new meaning to things happening in the world. And but this construction of meaning can be interactive and iterative and social. So in the following section, I'll follow on the second and third threads the notion of mobilizing offline action and the social construction of how people understand the world. But now is one of those moments that I said I'll pause for a second and see if there are any clarification questions or any urgent questions. We'll give that a try. Sorry, I see on my other screen a chat here. Okay, well, I will continue. I'm actually not quite sure how I would see any messages, but I'll go ahead. Okay, so I'm going to talk next about mechanisms tying online disinformation to offline behavior. So as I mentioned earlier, there's been extensive interest in disinformation especially since 2016, but as I alluded to earlier, the scholarly evidence that disinformation changes people's offline behavior is relatively thin. And this is because of several challenges in studying this question. So first, just a simple definition question, scholars are faced with this notion of like what online content counts as disinformation. You might think it's disinformation, I might not think it is, so how do we measure this? What exactly counts as consuming online disinformation? So is it simply that reading or viewing it should change my offline behavior, or is it the fact that I have to remember it or that I have to believe it? So how do we measure this exposure or this consumption? And then what kind of data out there connects the consumption of online content and offline action? So, and the idea here is that people, when you consume online material, you're kind of disembodied from time and space, whereas an offline action is a concrete event in time and space. And so how do we connect these two? And we can often observe what people do online or observe what they do offline, but linking this is very hard in terms of having data on it. And then finally, one challenge is what I mentioned earlier, which is the selection into consumption. And just to reiterate, but this is kind of a real key problem, is whether the consumption of disinformation changes my beliefs, changes people's beliefs, and thus my behavior. And this is, I think, kind of what a lot of people think about disinformation, that you'll have this kind of offline concrete change. But of course, people's existing beliefs and my existing behavior also drive my consumption. I may already not necessarily believe in, a particular, in the legitimacy of institutions and election institutions. And because I'm skeptical of institutions, I may then be more likely to consume stop the steal disinformation. Or because I already believe that, essentially, or I'm skeptical of my local election officials. So it turns out that after the January 6th riot at the US Capitol, there was some anonymous online activists scraped all of Parler, which was a right-leaning or kind of a social media platform that was popular with conservatives around the world, mostly in the United States. But this was fully scraped and put online in January 2021 before Parler was kicked off of AWS, or AWS was going to deplatform it. But before this happened, it was scraped and shared. And this data structure, when this happened, I recognized that this data structure could address some of these challenges I mentioned earlier. Specifically, there were geocoded observations of activity on Parler which helped to link online activity and offline events. Now we knew where people were when they were consuming or they were active on Parler, and this can be linked to things that happened in the offline domain. In addition, the observations repeated over time, or there are multiple observations over time of both of users and locations, and this would help identify the relationship between online activity and subsequent offline events. So the notion that, regardless of what your baseline beliefs are, if you consume more Parler, did the beliefs change compared to that baseline? So this helped address the selection issue. And also the data included observations of post content, which allowed insight into what was happening in the online activity, which could be driving offline behavior. So during 2021 and 2022, I conducted a study that linked activity on Parler to hard right protests, and brawls, and melees. So, think about maybe the Proud Boys getting in these large kind of melees in Portland, Oregon, and things like this, but also just many right-wing protests in the United States during 2020. And this article was published in 2023 in American Sociological Review. And I also analyzed the content of the activity to gain insight into what might be driving a connection between online activity and offline unrest. So this was mostly a content analysis on that side. So the evidence, what I found, first of all, just linking online activity on Parler to offline civil unrest, I found it was actually quite small effect size, but it was statistically significant and survived many checks and robustness checks and additional tests. Like we tried everything to make the statistical relationship go away, but we gained a lot of confidence in the fact that the more time people spent on Parler, increased slightly, but significantly, the probability of more hard right civil unrest in the offline domain. So once we had this, my colleagues and I established this finding, we investigated why would these things be linked? Why would online activity be linked to offline behavior? So in the scholarship, one very prevalent argument or mechanism is coordination. Simply that people use Parler to organize events, or in this case, people would use Parler to organize events. Social media is a way to organize ourselves and participate in an event. And it turned out that we didn't find any evidence of this when we examined the content of Parler posts. And we hypothesized that often this might be because a lot of this coordination mechanism has been identified in studies in the authoritarian context where the state controls the media, and social media is kind of an alternative channel to organize. But in the United States, that's not necessarily as important because there are many, many other ways people can organize than on social media, because an authoritarian state doesn't completely dominate the media landscape. A second mechanism was radicalization. And so this is the idea, applied to this context, would be the idea that using Parler would change people in a certain way, radicalize them, would change them into kinds of people who would then engage in protests or fights or brawls or melees. And we actually found no evidence of this either. I don't have a ton of time, so I'm not going to get into exactly how we measure this, but I'm happy to elaborate in the Q&A. What we did find evidence of was a third mechanism, which we called a shift in perceptions of social norms. So the idea here is that using Parler changed people's understandings of what was acceptable, and those who already wanted to engage in civil unrest were more likely to do so because they thought it was acceptable. And I'll elaborate on this in this following slide. So the evidence here that we found was that using Parler shifted people's perceptions of social norms. So how would this happen? Well, we all have an understanding of what's socially acceptable. And this understanding comes from observing people around us. And studies have shown, especially comes from cues by people we consider as leaders or elite figures, high status figures in our whatever social groups are important to us. We kind of understand what is acceptable and not. And like other social media platforms, Parler had its share of elites. And in the case of Parler, these tend to be conservative media personalities and politicians. So when I was developing this this idea, I posited that if users experienced their ideas and expressions later echoed by platform elites, they would understand this as a signal that their ideas were acceptable. So in the analysis, what I did was I compared users' posts at time 1 to elites' posts at time 2. And I found that some users experienced, or they would have seen, their ideas, things that they had said, echoed back at them by the elites more than some other users. So other users would say things that were not repeated back by elite users. And it turned out that the places where the users who experienced the feedback, those places where these users resided, because we could geolocate them, these places had higher rates of subsequent unrest. So what we interpreted this as evidence consistent with this argument that spending time on Parler kind of shifted people's ideas of what was acceptable because they were getting this feedback of acceptability from spending time on Parler. And then some of the idea was that some of these users would have already believed in acting out offline violence. They already thought this was what they wanted to do or what should be done. And whereas before they might have thought it was taboo or unacceptable, because by spending time on Parler, they increasingly thought it was acceptable. And then to the point where some eventually went out and engaged in that or did that offline. So some lessons for Parler and some lessons from Parler and civil unrest for disinformation is that would be that disinformation, assuming that was prevalent on Parler during 2020, which it definitely was, because there was lots of discussion about the election and COVID and all this. The lesson from the study is that disinformation can mobilize offline behavior. And so this aligns with the earlier Stop the Steal research I talked about collective action frames. But what my study found was that the Parler content did not mobilize offline behavior by coordinating people in an event or changing people's thinking, for example, with a collection action frame. Instead, the content involved the social construction of how people understood the world. It involved this kind of iterative process or interactive process of how people understood what was acceptable. So this aligns with the part from the earlier research about how campaigners reinterpreted bureaucratic processes and how they manufactured an event to give the event more meaning. So in the next section, I'm going to conclude by following the idea that disinformation involves the social construction of how people understand the world, and I'll end by returning to questions of definition. But here again, I'll just stop for a couple seconds and see if there's any pressing questions or clarification questions. Okay, so just a couple final slides here on more general lessons for disinformation, especially thinking about how we can think about disinformation. So what I've shown so far, what I've talked about so far, is this idea that disinformation can influence offline behavior through an interactional social dynamic. So this interactive iterative view of disinformation relates to earlier mentions of definitional questions. So in the literature, kind of the prevailing view in the social science scholarship on disinformation, the prevailing view has adopted this kind of transmission perspective. And what I mean by this, you can think about like somebody saying using the telegram, right, or sending a message, across the wires. And the idea here is that information moves independently of and faster than physical entities. It's kind of how the transmission perspective in communication research is kind of thought of. This idea that we send out messages, we transmit them. So this view of disinformation, of kind of sending out packets of disinformation out in the world, kind of across the wires or over social media, if we adopt this view, this prompts questions about the spread and the diffusion of disinformation and about people's role in transmitting it. Who transmits it, who receives it, when is it transmitted, when is it received? These are kind of questions that come up if we adopt this perspective. However, there's an emerging some communication scholars are encouraging a different perspective. And they refer to this as communication as ritual. And the idea here is that disinformation is a form of participatory knowledge making. It's something that people do together to create knowledge and understanding about the world. And it's so under this view, disinformation is constructed by groups of people who are piecing together identities and narratives and drawing on social relationships. And the idea is and they're doing this to value stories and positions, or kind of highlight narratives and stories that resonate within their community, that make sense or have currency in their community, rather than objective truth. So the currency or the goal is not to arrive on quote unquote objective truth, but rather to kind of construct a story that resonates with the identities and kind of the social relationships that are important within their group. And so this is the notion of a ritual. And some communication scholars, here I cite them, Bastos and Tudors, who are advancing this, actually use an analogy of an actual ritual of kind of a Christian church service, or you could think of like any type of kind of notion of a ritual, whether it's Christian or not. And the quote here is that what happens in a lot of religious rituals is that the goal is not necessarily to learn something new. And the goal of a lot of rituals is, not to learn anything, it's often not to learn anything new. And it's often not to provide essentially accurate information, but rather the purpose of rituals is often to advance a view of the world that kind of confirms the group and resonates with the group and makes sense for that group. So I have this quote here in the right-hand column of the slide where, they essentially elaborate on this. So I'll end here with these kind of two contrasting perspectives and definitions of disinformation. And I'm very eager to hear what people think about any part of the talk or about this kind of emerging debate in how to conceptualize disinformation. So thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I think we have so many questions. I'll let Bonnie begin.
Hi, thank you, Daniel. That was fascinating. I have a lot of questions, but I'll try to keep it to one or two. So I was interested in, I liked the way that you laid out the different mechanisms by which social media can function in disinformation and then people's subsequent behavior. I think that's a good framework for understanding the kind of the competing explanations. And then the mechanism for which you found evidence, the kind of shift in perception of social norms. I was wondering if you could help me understand the word acceptable a little bit more, sort of, because I sort of just to push back a little bit, like the people that are sitting there on Parler, maybe they hear their viewpoints echoed back and maybe even by people that they perceive as important, but they still know that violence is usually kind of like not just not acceptable, but also illegal. So I wonder if, like, should I understand acceptable as kind of that mechanism is sort of as a disinhibiting factor or something like that. To what extent, like, does that defray people's understanding of, like, this is actually, like, I'm not allowed to do what I want to do? And then the second is, does this mechanism only work if people hear their viewpoints relayed back to them by elites, or is it sufficient for them to see that it's broadly acceptable among, like, a big swath of their interlocutors on social media? Thanks.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just writing this down. And also trying to buy time to think about the first question, which is, sorry, I might have to ask you to maybe elaborate a little bit about how to think of acceptability. But so I'll start with the second question about elites versus whether it's broadly acceptable. That's a great question. Actually, no one has ever asked that question. I presented that paper that project for a long time, and it didn't come up in the review process or any talks. Yeah, I think we were driven by some research, mostly in political science, about the role of elites and the importance of elites in establishing social norms and kind of people taking cues from elites. And there's some really fascinating studies. There's one that comes to mind about promoting inter-religious sect tolerance in Lebanon. And it was an experiment using Twitter posts that, they showed participants in the study, Alexandra Siegel and a collaborator, who Alexandra is a political scientist at University of Colorado, showed people tweets kind of promoting religious tolerance between different groups in Lebanon. And it turned out that the tweets only actually changed people's kind of views of tolerance if they were endorsed or came from a religious figure, right? And so this was kind of this study, I think, kind of got me thinking in terms of the importance of elites and establishing norms. So I think I just went down that route. But certainly what you propose could be so the answer to your question is that I'm not sure in this particular case, because we didn't look at the echoing back of just Parler in general, because we were able to identify elites, which I could get into if you want. So we didn't investigate that, so I'm not sure empirically, but I think conceptually it would still work the same. At least the way I'm thinking about this mechanism, which is that, and this is maybe a kind of segue to your first question, which is simply that as long as the idea that, yeah, you start off with this notion like certain things are not allowed or unacceptable or taboo, and by spending time on social media, especially a particular type of social media argument, these ideas start to shift, and you kind of start developing a new understanding of what would be acceptable. And this process is perhaps accelerated or most efficient if it's elites doing it. But I think it's completely plausible that it would also happen simply by kind of the general user base. But we didn't investigate that. So your first question of like how to think of what's acceptable, do you mind elaborating a little bit on that?
Well, just because I imagine that, no, I think as somebody who might feel that they agree more with, like political left, right? Like that, I'd like to imagine that it's almost alluring to imagine that people who would think that the election was stolen or something like that, just are not as smart or something like that. But it's like, no, I actually think we don't give people enough credit. Like the wool hasn't necessarily completely been pulled over their eyes, as you've shown. Like it's kind of they understand a lot, right? And it's sort of like they're not being radicalized just being on Parler. So it's not necessarily that their views are even changing on certain issues. But so I guess for me, I'm skeptical of the idea that people, I guess I want to understand the word acceptable more, that something has become acceptable, because I imagine that people are still smart enough to understand that if they want to go out and beat people up, like that's against the law. Or if they want to, if they sort of want, they want to stuff ballot boxes or something, like that's against the law. So people know this. So how does that figure into their understanding of acceptability?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so yeah, that helps me think a little bit more about, or at least kind of express how I'm thinking about it, which is, yeah. So I guess the way that I would put it is that there's a distribution in society, right, of people, and the point that I want to make, or what I thought that the evidence was pointing towards, is that some portion, which I think is actually very small, because it turns out that simply if I just, if I have more time to talk about this particular project and I just show you descriptive statistics and like counts of events and stuff, it turns out that actually violence is extremely rare, right? And we hear about it a lot in the news, but it doesn't actually happen all that often. And so people participating in these events are quite few in number, like very, very few. And the events are rare. So in this distribution of society, there's just a small portion of people who engage in events like this. And the way I interpreted the evidence was that not that people radicalized and came to be more violent, they transformed in some way, but that already in society, there's a portion of society that thinks that that they want to do this, or they have some motivation to do this. But what's hindering them is the kind of the social world that is kind of inhibiting that desire, or that kind of decision that has already been taken, that, I should, the best way to save America, or best way to like make the future brighter for me and my family or whatever, is to go beat up some Antifa people in Portland, right? Like that decision has been made. But the people I interact with, are telling me or signaling to me that like I shouldn't do that. And the idea is that that spending a lot of time on a place like Parler would start making that fuzzier, in the sense of what exactly is kind of condoned, or what exactly would be viewed as justifiable. So maybe a different word rather than acceptability might be justifiable. And so the idea, yes, I completely agree with you, like people still know that it's wrong or illegal, but rather that by interacting or spending time with a certain group, in a certain kind of discursive space, the justifiability becomes more clear to themselves. I don't know if that helps elaborate, but yeah, great question.
I'm going to turn to the audience. Tracy Jewett has her hand raised. I'm just going to give you the mic to ask your question.
Oh, that was my first time doing that. I'm so interested in this. I had this feeling today that I had to leave work early, so I didn't miss this seminar because I knew it would be so good. There was something you said about like advance a view of the world that confirms the group and resonates with the group. And I was wondering if there's like a psychology piece to it, do you think?
Yeah. Sorry, was that your question? Is whether there's a psychology?
Yeah, I didn't really word it as a question, but I was wondering what you thought about that. Like, if you think there's a psychology piece to it, because it makes me think of like, I think it's Maslow. You ever watch that episode of The Simpsons where if there's someone in power and he's electrocuting people, and Maslow did this experiment that all the other regular normal type people that you were talking about, they would also start electrocuting the person. I mean, The Simpsons obviously went a little crazy, but they do it just because someone else that they like look up to is doing it, right? Or like that prison experiment they did in the 60s. They might have done it at Yale, where they put some of the students are prisoners, some of the students are guards, and they had to shut down the whole experiment within a few weeks because all kinds of atrocities were happening just because people had that little bit of power.
Right. Yeah, I think I stopped watching The Simpsons, I think after season 6 or 7, which I think it peaked, but I might be dating myself. So I don't exactly remember that episode. But yeah, I think it was the Milgram experiments, which is the person in the lab coat telling people to electrocute other people. And then I think the prison experiment was at Stanford by I just lost the name, but another famous psychologist. But yeah, I mean, thanks, Tracy, for the I'm glad you found the talk interesting, and I'm always happy to give people an excuse to leave work early. Yeah, I can't say much about the psychology aspect of it. I guess as a sociologist, it's kind of like, well, how much it's kind of almost transgressive to get into psychological explanations. But I'm sure there's some, the way I would respond to this question, well, first, there's obviously a lot of research in psychology about disinformation and kind of what happens there. I think I would point to, in response, without kind of getting into that domain, which I don't know very well, I would point to this notion of maybe a reduction in complexity. And something I do know from psychology, or a little bit of psychology, is that, humans really benefit a lot from reduction in uncertainty and complexity. And this idea, at least in the Stop the Steal campaign, what these other researchers found was that a lot of that disinformation served the function of reducing the complexity of local election processes. Although I do want to circle back to something that Bonnie brought up, which is it's not to say that people are kind of less smart or unable to understand certain processes, but rather just that there's some things we don't know, or I don't know exactly the ins and outs of how my local elections work and what needs to happen, who certifies what. And I think just the notion that disinformation can kind of smooth this out a little bit, or just make it more comprehensible for people who don't have a lot of time and don't have a lot of resources to look into things. And that I do think there's probably a cognitive kind of benefit or payoff to that. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't know a ton about psychology to kind of elaborate beyond that, but thanks. There's a lot there for sure, though. And if anyone else has something to say about psychology, they could weigh in, I guess. There are psychologists in the audience.
Thanks so much, Tracy. Again, I think you had a question as well.
Yeah, great. Oh, this was so provocative and interesting. And the field of media studies, of course, the question of transmission, the question of media effects is a huge, huge, longstanding debate, right? So, you're touching on a nerve that's been pulsing for many, many decades in media studies, and particularly so in recent years, since say 2000, with the development of our online activities, the question of when and how are we going to be able to see that online events lead to anything offline, and how will we measure that, right? So this is incredibly tricky. So I really appreciated your moving to the ritual view, that some of the theories of that were developed, I've often been surprised at how little they were taken up, particularly in political communications. Though thinking about cultural studies, of course, since Stuart Hall's work, there's been a big pushback against the transmission view, and much more of an embrace of what's included in that ritual view. So I'm curious about your thoughts about, cultural studies' role in this. So I have two specific questions. One, to build on Bonnie's, and this is unrelated to the online, offline perhaps, but the elites, when you're speaking of elites, are you speaking also, or did you take into account influencers, right? Because I think that's also related to this. Is it just elites? How do we account for the influence of influencers in these social media spaces? And the other question is that sticky one of correlation. So what you spoke of certainly shows us a correlation of the, offline events with the activity online, but I wonder how you grapple with that question of correlation versus cause.
Yes. So I'll start with the second question, which, yeah, I have a more straightforward answer to, and then the influencers. Sorry, I'm just writing down so I don't forget to talk about influencers. So yeah, I mean, this isn't the study that I referred to is an observational study, obviously. So it's not causally identified in the way an experiment is, which, the exposure I have to media studies and the effects of media studies, the stuff I've read has been kind of in an experimental framework. So that's my kind of familiarity with that, which is obviously not my area. So yeah, so ultimately, I can't say that it is definitively causally identified. There are several things we do in the paper that adopt causal empiricist strategies of trying to infer causality from observational data. Just not to get into the weeds of it, but we start with a kind of a basic regression, which established correlation. We're kind of confident in the directionality of it because of the temporal sequencing. We're able to observe units over time. And so we're able to kind of estimate changes based on increases or decreases in parlor activity. So this kind of establishes one criterion for causality, which is direction. The tough one, of course, is ruling out other stuff. So what we end up doing is, we did some kind of matching strategies of matching most alike cases, but this is not perfect. And then ultimately, what we settled on was there's some strategies that you can do with quantitative analyses where you estimate the effect or you estimate how large an omitted confounder would have to be to wipe out your effects. So essentially, you didn't control for everything. There could be other things that are confounding the causal relationship that simply make it correlational. But like how big would this have to be, this magnitude of this? And what we found when we run these tests is that any omitted confounders would have to be larger than the effect of preceding protests predicting subsequent protests. So the idea is that, places that had like a lot of protests, like think about Portland, Oregon, whatever, these protests kind of predicted a protest the next week, let's say. So that relationship, anything that we left out of our model that would kind of undercut or wipe out our effects would have to be larger than that. So what we wrote in the paper is that, we can't perfectly causally identify this, but at least we're giving you this information where, if we had more time, I realize we're out of time, we can have a kind of like a principled discussion as to like whether you think that all the stuff that we didn't take into account would be larger than this other effect, which we observe and can kind of compare to as a benchmark. So yeah, but ultimately, we say like, we're very confident about this, but it's not causally identified. The question about influencers, yeah, definitely for sure. In this particular case, it turned out that Parler assigned badges, kind of on Twitter, these blue badges or whatever they are now. I'm actually not on that anymore. Parler assigned many different colored badges, and the elites had this gold badge, and so that's how we identify the elites. And there was a footnote, we kind of included a little bit of discussion about how similar these are to influencers or whatnot, and we acknowledge that there's great overlap in these concepts, but we like the idea of elites because a lot of the people with gold badges were kind of influencers or elites actually off of Parler as well. So these would maybe be figures in the conservative movement, politicians or whatever, who just simply in the social media space were not constantly producing content in the way we may think of influencers, but they were Rudy Giuliani or something, right? Who didn't actually post that much, but if he said something, however infrequently he posted, if he said something on Parler that kind of echoed back at your previous ideas, that this would be kind of very impactful. So this is how we differentiated elites versus influencers. I don't know. I know you had one other question about cultural perspective, but okay. I don't know.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'd love to continue this conversation though another time.
Take one final question from the audience, which is from Arvidas Krishnas, who says, thank you for the presentation. There was a lot of talk about Russian interference when it came to Trump's election campaign. Is there any reason to think about external agency when it comes to the Capitol riots as well?
Yeah, good question. Like external influence in those riots. My initial answer, because I don't, I was drawing on somebody else's study, so I don't actually examine that particular event in my own work. But I think it's interesting about the Russian interference is that the research has come out recently, and I wish I could remember the paper, but it was published in the last few months, showed that the kind of the Twitter accounts that were set up by the Internet Research Institute in Russia, that very few Americans were exposed to them, to that actual content. So they didn't have a huge breadth of reach in the United States, or at least amongst Twitter users. But we can kind of link that finding with other findings that show that actually, what it appears is that the people spreading disinformation on social media are not great in number, but they're very prolific. And so what could be kind of applying those two insights to the January 6th riot, the way I would answer this would be maybe posing a question or kind of encouraging us to think maybe some more, which would be that perhaps that any external influence would not be very great or very wide in magnitude, but kind of the interesting question would be, how broad does it have to be, or how many people would have to be exposed to that or influenced by that to make a difference, or to make it happen? And so that I don't know empirically, but yeah, just based on the 2016 research, it seems like not, in terms of numbers, not a lot of people are exposed to those types of influences, but that might be enough to make a difference.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. It was a really fascinating talk, and it's given us a lot to think about. And I'm pretty sure we'll have more questions coming up in our minds even afterwards. And hopefully those are things that we can touch upon in future conversations and future sessions online. Thank you so much again for your time and for presenting. For our audience, I just wanted to share that we'll be continuing the series. We have one more talk on Thursday before the kind of winter recess. This one is called Visual Investigations, Reporting with and Verifying Online Open Source Information. And this is with Haley Willis, who is with the Visual Investigations team at the New York Times. That if you're familiar with the reporting, they were the ones who identified sort of in recent news, sort of some conflicts with stories that their own reporters had done, and correcting information from within the New York Times itself. So it's really fascinating work that they're doing. So I have the link in the chat to sign up. It's also on the Peace and Development website online. But thank you so much for coming. And we hope we see you and hear from you in the future. All right. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.